Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Dr. Mahnoor Bangash. I have recently completed my BDS in February 2020 and my house job got delayed because of this pandemic. So instead of just wasting more time, I have decided to start studying for those different exams that we have to give, and I'll be making videos of the topics that I cover just to make things a little interesting for me. So, this is the book that I'll be studying from, and the topic of this very first video is the very first topic of this book, which is cell membrane. And if any one of you have trouble started studying, just like me, you guys can start it now. And so let's get started. Okay, we all know that everything that we see around us, whether living or non-living, are made up of tiny little things called cells. And so more specifically, this cell is called the building block of the human body. The different physiological processes that are going on in our body, which involve the movement or in and out movement of molecules and different ions into the cell or out of the cell, and they require crossing of a barrier. That barrier is called cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is a thin and elastic membrane, and it is the outermost covering of a cell which separates an individual cell from its surrounding environment, which is the extracellular environment. Now, this cell membrane is also called a lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer. Now, bi here means two, which means that your cell membrane is made up of two layers of lipid, and each layer is one molecule thick. This is the diagram of this lipid bilayer, and this is one layer, whereas this is the other layer. These two layers collectively make up this lipid bilayer. This is a very important diagram, and I'm going to discuss each and every component of the cell membrane through this diagram. Okay, we have three components of cell membrane. They're the carbohydrates, phospholipids, and proteins. Now, proteins, we have two types of proteins: the integral or the intrinsic proteins, peripheral or the extrinsic proteins. And then we have phospholipids. Phospholipid has, this is these jellyfish like structure. This is a phospholipid. This is a phospholipid. Now, phospholipid molecule has a head and two tails. Okay, and this is the molecular structure or chemical structure of the phospholipid. This thing here is the head, and these two red ones are the tails. Okay, as you can see that the tails are made up of organic chain, their organic structure, and because of their organic nature, these tails are, because of their organic nature, they are hydrophobic. And the head here has a nitrogenous group, phosphate group, and glycerol. Glycerol makes the backbone of the head. And this phosphate group, because it is ionic, it's an inorganic molecule. So because of this phosphate group, head is hydrophilic in nature. Okay, and so how do we get this lipid bilayer structure of the cell membrane, this whole arrangement? We all know that the major part or the main component of cell membrane is the phospholipid. Phospholipid have two parts, the head and the tail. Okay, and since let's say this is one uh, molecule of a phospholipid, and this is another molecule of a phospholipid. This black part is the tail and the white part are heads. So this tail part of one molecule, because of similar in nature, is attracted towards the tail part of the other phospholipid molecule, and because of this mutual attraction between these tails of the two phospholipid molecules, we get this kind of arrangement in which the tails are in the middle and the head parts are on the sides of the membrane. Okay, so because of this interaction or this attraction between the tails of phospholipids, we get this kind of arrangement. Since now we can see in this diagram that the tails are in the middle and in sides we have the head. Because of this, the middle part of the membrane is hydrophobic and all the water insoluble substances will be attracted to this part, such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, or the steroid hormones. And the sides of the membrane, because of the head part, are hydrophilic. So all the inorganic or water and water soluble substances will be attracted to the sides of the membrane. Then this next component is protein. We have two types of proteins, the integral or the intrinsic proteins, or peripheral and the extrinsic proteins. Okay, these green ones are the intrinsic proteins and the blue ones are the extrinsic proteins. So intrinsic proteins, they protrude all the way through the membrane, whereas extrinsic proteins, they do not protrude or they do not pass this whole membrane. These are at the periphery, they're very loosely attached to the membrane through electrostatic interaction, whereas these intrinsic ones are embedded in the membrane because of uh, hydrophobic interaction, and these extrinsic proteins, they are very loosely attached. There is no covalent bonding between the membrane and these proteins and the surrounding structure. Okay, we have different functions of these proteins. Now the intrinsic ones, they may act as channels or pores for the passage of the different water soluble substances, mostly through the membrane, or they may act as carrier proteins or receptor for the water soluble substances, whereas extrinsic proteins may act as enzymes or controller of transport of substances through the pores. Then the third and the last component is carbohydrate. This tree-like structure here, this is a carbohydrate. So we have two different forms of carbohydrates, the glycoproteins and the glycolipids. Here these carbohydrates are attached to protein part of the membrane, so they'll be the glycoproteins, and if they're attached to this lipid part of the membrane, they'll be called glycolipids. Okay, so let's say this fist of mine. Okay, this fist, just consider it as a cell and the skin as a cell membrane, whereas these two, consider them as carbohydrates protruding out of the cell membrane or out of the cell. Since cell membrane is the covering which covers the entire surface of the cell, and the carbohydrates are present over the entire surface of the cell, so this arrangement of carbohydrates is called glycocalyx. These carbohydrates also have certain functions, like they may help in attachment of the two adjacent cells together, or they may act as receptors, or since some of them have a negative charge, so they'll give an overall negative charge to the cell. And the last topic is intercellular connections. This is a topic of anatomy, or so I'll be just giving a brief introduction of what these connections are. We have two main types, the tight junctions and the gap junctions. Now, gap junction is basically, it is also called a communicating junction. Okay, why is it called a communicating junction? Okay, let's see, this is the cell membrane of one cell, and this is the cell membrane of another cell, and these green ones, they are the intercellular channels between these two cells. So your gap junctions are actually intercellular channels in the plasma membrane, between which is communicating, or which is attaching, through which the membranes of the two cells are communicating with each other. Okay, so it's like, for example, we have this cell and this is the other cell, cell 1, cell 2, and just imagine it like this, that it's kind of a bridge, a channel which is connecting or communicating these two individual cells together. And this is the lipid bilayer or the cell membrane of one cell, and this is of another cell. These are the channels which are made up of 6 connexin proteins. CONNEXO. 6 connexin proteins form these channels, and they may help in signal transmission in brain and may permit current flow in the myocardial cells. The second one is tight junctions. So tight junctions are also called zonular occludens. Okay, and they're based attachment between the cells, such as epithelial cells, or they may be in intercellular pathways. Now, in tight junctions, the membranes of two cells, membrane 1 and membrane 2, these membranes are tightly pressed against each other. Okay, so this one membrane and this is the other membrane. These two membranes are tightly pressed against each other, and this junction is formed by two different types of transmembrane proteins, clotting and occludin. Now, these tight junctions can be tight or leaky. Leaky means they're permeable, such as in the proximal renal tubule or in the gallbladder, and they may be tight, which means impermeable, such as in the renal distal tubule. Okay, so this was all about this topic. And if you guys found this video informative or helping, please like, subscribe, and share. Dafis, and thank you.